Today we're taking an all-inclusive look at why every Zelda game by its fans is claimed to be the best in the series. And I think there is an answer, or at least part of one, but the truth may be hard to hear if you're especially fond of one particular title. Everyone has their favorite Legend of Zelda game, and very, very soon, like scarily soon, we'll get to viciously grasp and fully devour Tears of the Kingdom on May 12th. Apparently, this one's supposed to be the best one yet, and judging by some of the trailers, I think it's worth getting pretty hyped over. Within this prospective future that Tears of the Kingdom might be yet another best of all time, I've really been thinking, how in the world is every Legend of Zelda game also the best Zelda game? From Ocarina to Breath of the Wild, we have a code to crack here that Nintendo has been holding captive for many years now. Well, my video essay today will be inspecting this question game by game, and I invite you to ponder alongside with me. What makes each game so special and revolutionary? I think by doing this, together we'll build some insight into what Nintendo has in store for us in the coming days for Tears of the Kingdom. You all set? Let's go. So, to start off, I want to frame this essay in the context of only the 3D Zelda entries. This video could be twice as long if we went back and deciphered the multiple great 2D Legend of Zelda games, but for the purposes of this video, Link's shift into 3D is where many people's all-time favorite adventure lies, and I believe we can glean the answer from them alone. That's not to say there's anything wrong or bad about Zelda in its infancy or its continuation in the DS console with Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks. Both games I love and adore, but I think they are their own separate category and deserve special attention and a separate analysis sort of thing. So let's start off with the big boy, Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time is where the story begins, and boy does it carry a reputation among fans of the series. And doing my research, I found a lot of ranking websites putting Ocarina of Time not only as the best Zelda game, but as the best 3D video game ever. In recent years, the ancient release date of 1998 shows the entry's age in graphics and gameplay. But even still, a generation of boomer gamers undoubtedly will carry their first memories of seeing Hyrule Castle in 3 dimensions above any other screen experience in their memory. And that's not just because it was one of the first 3D adventure games, it's jointly also because of the insane and unique quality this title carries. Ocarina of Time was Link's first imagining in 3D, like I've said, much like Mario in Super Mario 64, and the graphical adjustment at that time was mind-boggling. I personally wasn't conscious enough to be part of this formative time in video game history, but I can only imagine the giddiness somebody could have at the thought of exploring a wonderfully crafted adventure in all 3 dimensions. Like, I can't even imagine how mind-blowing that would be. On top of that, it's not just any place, it's the land of Hyrule, which portrayed all the majesty and magic that have so often accompanied Legend of Zelda games ever since. It set the standard. Ocarina of Time was unique not only because of its cinematic 3D world, but also its intricately crafted dungeon experiences. The foundation of Link's gameplay occurs in these temples, which is why we still hear people telling us what they did inside their temple experiences. To be fair, much murmuring has been spent hurling justified disdain at the infamous water temple, yeah, but as a whole, these dungeons were absolutely unique, revolutionary, and frankly, second to none in terms of their competitor franchises. Ocarina of Time's soundtrack is just about as legendary as video game soundtracks could ever hope to become. We all know this song. We all know this song. These beloved tunes are etched into our brains, and I would wager that most of us haven't even played Ocarina of Time, yet we can still hum along. How impressive is that? The work of composer Koji Kondo in this game is so masterfully done that it's almost revered as sacred and holy to gamers everywhere. It's inarguable the Ocarina of Time was perhaps the greatest achievement in modern gaming up to that point, and for that I respect it profoundly. It's likely impossible to draw a line citing all the video games that have been and are still being influenced by Ocarina. Maybe 95% of 3D games can trace back some DNA to the groundwork Ocarina laid. But do people think it's still the best Zelda game? The answer to fans who played it as a kid is an overwhelming yeah. And I think it's easy to contextualize why exactly that is. So this is the hands down best Zelda game of all time, right? Well, let's continue on. Speaking of Ocarina's influence, let's talk about its otherworldly successor. The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask was not actually as much of a bombshell when it first released as it is now renowned as today. When Majora's Mask was first released in April of the year 2000, young fans had a difficult time grappling with whatever this weird, dark, atmospheric adventure was. The assets, dungeons, quests, and even some of the characters were very familiar or even duplicates of those from Ocarina, but wow, does the game feel incredibly different despite its asset reuse. One giant cog that sets Majora's Mask apart from its predecessor is its rhythm and tempo. If you're not familiar with the famous 3-day cycle, basically every 3 game days or 54 minutes in real life, the ghastly moon of Termina with its seething eyes collides with and obliterates the town of friendly villagers, which instantly causes game over for you and them. 54 minutes to solve the entire game? I can see why kids hated it. Well, that's where the game's distinct gimmick comes to play. And I don't say gimmick in a bad way. What Majora's Mask is known for, ironically more than Ocarina of Time, is that by playing your trusty clay flute, you can slow down and reset the time passing. By doing that, Link has the power to alter and manipulate events and quest lines, which ultimately will save the Clock Town. But here's the thing. Apparently, the day management mechanic straight up confused a lot of young adventurers who were expecting a mere continuation of Ocarina of Time. Fans were no longer venturing around Hyrule Field with a traditional sense of grandeur and knighthood, but instead were wandering around the gutters of a rainy town, watching its residents suffer. The moon of the sky looms dreadfully over Clock Town and is an ever-present mental reminder that the balance of the land completely rests on you. Honestly, that's a lot to handle for a 10 to 12-year-old. Majora's Mask is constantly dealing with themes of death, which is a lot for young boys and girls. The fact of the matter is that Nintendo actually took a massive risk with the content of this game when we realized contextually the audience that its predecessor garnered. But does this mean that it's bad? Absolutely not. Are there people who think this is the best Zelda game? Yep, but the question is why? The matter of fact is the strangeness that sets it apart is exactly why it's adored so much. The doom and gloom coupled with the shift of focus onto the particulars of the lives of the villagers really flesh out the game in a sense that these NPCs actually live or die and they require your in-game influence for them to be saved. It was weird and revolutionary, even if at the time it was off-putting to some. More recently, we've seen the narrative continue of dark internet folklore that surrounds Majora's Mask due to alternate gaming experiences, creepypastas, and other mythical tales about other aspects of the game. But that's a whole other chapter in this that I'm not going to go into right now. If you're really interested and you're not familiar with it, go ahead and go look up Ben Drowned and be prepared to go down one of the most influential internet rabbit holes of video game history you can find. What I'm trying to say is though Majora's Mask was polarizing and different, it still ended up improving many of the core mechanics that Ocarina of Time had. Dungeons, combat, characters, etc. were all once again such a high quality that it likewise carries an enormous reputation even today. At the end of the day, here we have another masterpiece in the Zelda franchise, but with that big M word, it certainly holds water in discussion of being the B word, the best, against the other greats. And yes, of course, once again, people say this is the best one definitively. But guess what? We haven't even talked about Wind Waker yet. Speaking of the best Zelda game, it's time for the actual best Zelda game. 2 years later, another installment in the Zelda franchise would sail forth from the bright blue ocean. The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. How did Nintendo follow up that dark, grimacing tone of Majora's Mask? Well, They did it with Toon Link. Not what a lot of fans were expecting, but perhaps you'll start to notice Nintendo's wheel of continual reinvention with every new Zelda game. In the case of the now beloved Wind Waker, at launch, fans of the previous titles were not keen on the simplified stylization of this next Zelda game. In some cases, internet forums were set ablaze, hurling criticisms against the game because of its art style. The bright colors, simple geometry, and cell shading were so different from what we'd seen before. To older fans, Link and Zelda were supposed to grow up just like they themselves had, and to see cartoonized versions of the characters they loved so much felt like a slap in the face straight from Nintendo headquarters. In a way, the simplification of the visual style felt like a dumbing down of the depth which older fans felt Zelda games represented. The cutting away of graphical fidelity seemed like the cutting away at fans' heartstrings. But now in retrospect, after the figurative dust has settled, we know this polarizing art direction was not an indication of the regression of quality. The disdain at the time has since been replaced with love. And I'd even argue that Wind Waker still looks top-notch today. Like many of the people probably watching this video, Wind Waker might have been your first Zelda game, and I guarantee if it was, it holds a nostalgic spot in your heart. As a kid, I wasn't concerned with the desire for a realistic Zelda game. All I knew was that I wanted to explore the bright blue ocean with my trusty King of Red Lions and see what the world had to offer. Now, my own personal bias is coming through, which I admit, but imagine this. A young child asks you for your recommendation of which Zelda game they should play first. You know I'm picking Wind Waker. Even though it's 21 years old, it would be a perfect fit to a beginner's journey. Wind Waker is accessible in a way the previous games weren't, and it's streamlined in a way for a first-timer to really appreciate and get a grasp of. Simplification isn't always bad, because the core formula still held up as strong as ever. Go out, solve dungeons, get tools, save Princess Zelda. It's all there, just less confusing. On a personal note, something about being surrounded by the vast, dangerous ocean really captured my adventurous heart as a child, and even today I'm struck with that same sense of adventure when I see pictures of the game. Finding little secrets and uncovering hiding spots felt so engaging and interesting to me, as they were accompanied with the most perfect soundtrack I could imagine. I mean, really, of every Zelda score, this one is gosh near the top of the list, right? I think in a lot of ways, Wind Waker emphasized adventure more than the other games, and for that reason, a whole lot of fans hold it to an amazingly high standard. Because of this, guess what? A lot of people say it's the best Zelda game. So we see the cycle again. Nintendo once again pulled out an evolution of Link's adventure that still radiated with quality and care. So is Wind Waker the best Zelda game? Well, yeah, of course, until 2006. The next reinvention came 4 years later, in November of 2006, as the world was introduced to Twilight Princess. This was that realistic Zelda people were waiting for, plus a dark, transformative story to counter Wind Waker and harken back to the darkness of Majora's Mask, aka the perfect formula for a Zelda game, right? Well, yeah, Twilight Princess, debuting on the Wii and the GameCube, was the quote, best Zelda game to date. And that sounds like an egregious claim considering the baddies that have already been talked about, but history proves otherwise. And doing my research, I found multiple posts and review sites praising Twilight Princess above its ancestors, and honestly, it's justified considering the once again sheer quality of the Zelda games. Structurally, people say this is the real sequel to the original Ocarina of Time, which at that point was already 8 years old. The inventive gimmick in Twilight Princess, which sets it apart, are its transitions into the Twilight Realms, which were essentially alternative dreamscape versions of Hyrule Castle that's being held captive by malicious evil forces. Part of solving the woes of the land is liberating those enslaved souls in Twilight and freeing the rightful leader of the land, Princess Midna. The story here is carefully woven, and I know it seems like every Zelda game has the greatest story and greatest characters, but Twilight Princess certainly stands out, probably due to it being the darkest and most adult of all these Zelda games, even more than the previously mentioned Majora's Mask, I would say. We've also got probably the best side companion to date, Midna. She's so full of charm, quirk, and adventure, without the annoying interjection that side companions usually have. Another compelling wrinkle in Twilight Princess is Link's ability to transform from human to wolf to help him solve certain puzzles as well as traverse in the world. Majora's Mask tinkered with this idea in a similar way, but it's not as fleshed out and thematically appropriate as it feels here. Super fans of this Zelda title will also point out the incredible consistency of dungeon designs, rivaling the all-time best dungeons in the whole series. Whether it's the Arbiter's Grounds or the City in the Sky, you can feel the heartbeat of care and passion that went into making them. There's a Wild Wild West section, water levels, a snow section, sumo fighting, the Temple of Time, and so much more, all packaged into the largest Nintendo adventure we had seen up to date. With all this being said, is it the best Zelda game? Well, of course, yeah. People freaking love this game, being an upgrade in tools, mechanics, dungeons, overall size, and more. In my opinion, ironically though, at the time being the most realistic looking Zelda, I think it's fair to say this is now one of the most visually dated Zelda games. But notwithstanding the optics of aging, this is basically Legend of Zelda in its purest form, and massive amounts of fans which saw its release in real time acclaim it to be the best definitive Zelda experience. Nintendo successfully reinvented and evolved a franchise for new fans, young and old, which is the exact same pattern we've already seen multiple times. Starting to see my point of the video here. Let's see for the next two massively polarizing games on this list if the reinvention rule still holds true. Alright, this is the controversial one. I know people are waiting for this section. Let's talk Skyward Sword. Can I be real with you for a second? I absolutely hate when people talk trash about Skyward. I am a personal fan of it, despite my acknowledgements of many people's disparaging thoughts against it. In my eyes, Skyward Sword is refined and defined as firstly a stellar Zelda title, not firstly as a gimmicky system seller that people have constrained it as being. I want to jump straight into the controversy, because that seems to be the only discussion point which feels unfair considering the overall amazing package, which I will share thoughts on later. The context here is that Skyward Sword was developed for and shipped for the famous Wii console. Like we all know, the Wii wasn't your standard controller. No, it was a weird motion-based remote control stick. And the idea in Skyward Sword was that swiping the Wii remote in real life meant that Link's actual in-game sword mimicked the IRL movements. The Wiimote hardware enabled this new mechanic in a way that hadn't been done before, though detractors claim the tech was not all the way there yet, and therefore Skyward Sword is bad. But I disagree. This feature alone of players being dissatisfied with the controls caused video game critics and review websites to call this the worst Zelda game of all time. I'm not joking. So with this in mind, I've been replaying it to see just how apparently terrible this experience is deemed to be. And going back and replaying it, I now know, and I can say confidently, that the reviewers were wrong. In my time of messing with these horribly gimmicky Wiimote controls, I actually found a lot of enjoyment out of them and found them to be immersive in a way more complex combat system than the other Zelda games. My hardware allowed for maybe 95% responsiveness in the in-game combat, which is far better than critical assessments claim it to be. I think I'd like to further address just how blown out of proportion Skyward Sword hate still is and was at the time of its release. But I think that should be wrapped up in a whole entire different video, so subscribe if you are interested in that. For now, let's address the less talked about wonderful side of Skyward Sword. It starts with its art direction. I think stylistically, the most fitting and expressive version of the Kingdoms of Hyrule is in Skyward Sword. The way the color scheme and game texturing is impressionistic. It reminds me of the beloved Ghibli style, but it's in all 3 dimensions. It's stunning. There's the charm and lightheartedness here of Wind Waker, with the adult version of Link from Twilight Princess. The story and characters were as compelling as any game in the series, and fans really love the Groot's redemption arc. Dungeons, area designs, and Link's toolkit all do great by Nintendo's standards, and there's so much to love here. All in all, there are people on both sides of the fence with Skyward Sword. Those who appreciate the added immersion that the Wiimote controls brought, and those who thought it was an overall weight around their wrists when it came to game enjoyment. There's so many other nuances to talk about this game, which I might make in another video like I said earlier. Some things are loved and some are hated. But I see this as a prime example of the wheel of Zelda evolution turning once again. Alright, it's time for the big one. The one you've all been waiting for. Hyrule Warriors. Just kidding, we're gonna skip that game. Conveying how influential Breath of the Wild is to video games is challenging. After our last mentioned game, Skyward Sword, Nintendo decided to take a hiatus from the mainline Zelda IPs and went back to the drawing board. On one hand, they had one of the most monumental and recognizable game series, with a legacy infused with video game culture itself. And on the other hand, you have a need and desire to innovate artistically as to not create the same piece of game over and over again. In June of 2014, almost 8 years ago, we got the first glimpse of open world Zelda, and it looked amazing. In 2016, we got the official gameplay reveal, and 1 year later, the actual game was in our hands. What can be said that hasn't already been expressed by one of the 20 million players of this mega hit? Breath of the Wild radically turned the classic formula on its head and created something new to witness, tinker with, and enjoy. No longer were fans limited to an enclosed zone or a specific topographical height. For the first time, everything just opened up. More than any game I've ever seen, you can literally just explore anything that you find. Other traditional staples of the Zelda franchise, besides just exploration, were also radically altered, such as dungeons, weapon types, eating mechanics, weather systems, and so much more. It seems people really enjoyed the freedom that Breath of the Wild offered, and it scratched a very unique and lucrative itch that wasn't present in other Nintendo legacy IPs yet. Admittedly, this wasn't the first open world game in the gaming industry. Actually, it was kind of late to the party in terms of open worlds. But even still, you will find so many people saying that it's their favorite that they've ever played. There's so many things you could talk about. There's so many videos on YouTube showing off the wonderful designs and cool things you can craft and tinker with, and it is something to behold for sure. I was personally not crazy about Breath of the Wild, but regardless of my dumb opinions, Breath of the Wild is objectively the best-selling Zelda game ever. And due to the sheer numbers, its popularity cements it right now as probably the Zelda game to rule them all at the moment. Every open world game, at least in the near future, will undoubtedly be compared to Breath of the Wild, and especially every new iteration of Link will certainly be compared against it in terms of scope and quality. In a few days, we will see Breath of the Wild's only worthy competitor release, its sequel, and I think it's going to be massive for the discussion of the franchise as a whole. I expect Tears of the Kingdom to reinvent some aspect of its prequels, like we've talked about time and time again with every single Zelda game. From the trailers, I would bet the fuse mechanic is going to play an insanely formative part in this new adventure, and it might just be the lightning in a cartridge that keeps the Switch relevant. Will it be the best Zelda game ever? Yeah, probably, based on the track record we've talked about. Which brings me to the decisive point to be made about why every Zelda game is the best. The point of the video. Every game is the best because the perfect Zelda formula is always being reinvented meaningfully to a new generation of fans. If Nintendo was still putting out pixel sprite 2D Zelda games on your average gaming hardware, they would not be relevant anymore. It may be hard for some fans to hear this, but if Nintendo made a game exactly the same as Ocarina of Time in 2023, it would receive little to no praise by gamers just because of how far Nintendo games and games in general have evolved. It's exciting to see what the future holds in store, and I'm grateful today that I took time to appreciate the magnificence of the past. The Legend of Zelda franchise is something almost universally loved, I think because it taps into that core human desire to just go out and see what the world has to offer. The danger, the mystery, the beauty, and the humor. So don't become a jaded fan like I was. Appreciate the evolutions and look forward to the future. I'm Dryblind. Thanks so much for watching, and have a good one.